China and India could be the two largest economies in the world by 2050. The world-renowned estimated report based on future economy and global economic prospect. They published this economic prospects report based on China and India. The shift of global economic power towards the emerging economies will largely driven by China and India. These two Asian giants are the key economic growth factors for the world GDP. They are contributing the large sector in the world GDP. China is already the largest economy in the world in terms of PPP, having overtaken the US in way back 2014. Is not yet the largest economy in GDP. And the expert has said that the China should overtake the US to take the first place on the basis before 2030. It is subject to the assumption of the degree of those China's market exchange rate with the PPP exchange, which are nonetheless the subject of uncertainty. Maybe it's subject to uncertainty. The projected GDP growth for the path of China and US is very similar, but China is slightly ahead and it would surpass US GDP by 2028 approximately. The current share of China's in world GDP at PPP stand for almost 18%, just above the US share of around 16%. This is projected to increase the peak of around 21% in 2030 before falling slightly to 20% by 2050. Further details of the view of China that are provided with the chief economist in IMF, that comparison has been made with US share of global GDP is projected to fall gradually but steadily to just below around 12% in 2050. India is currently comprises 7% of the GDP at PPP, which we project to rise steadily over 15% by 2050. This is remarkable increase of 8% point, gaining the most ground of any of the countries that is focused around the experts. The model indicate that India has the potential to overtake the US as the second largest economy in the world by 2040 around in GDP. And looking at the GDP in the other sectors, other field, basically, India is unlikely to overtake US in the ranking and remain relatively a large difference between India's GDP and even in 2050, because India's price level is still likely to be well below the advanced economic level, it is reflected in relatively low income per capita levels. Rise of China and India also reduced the share of world GDP accounted by the European country, European Union 27, with India projected to be larger than European 27 by 2035. As a result, the share of world economy for the European Union in PPP is projected to fall steadily from almost 15% to 9% by 2050, while the exact extent and timing of this shift is subject to considerable uncertainty. The general direction of changes in any graph of estimated report is very clear. It's evident that European Union share is reduced in the future economic field, economic report. Meanwhile, the European Union in this report refer to the European Union 27, excluding the UK, since we assume the UK will leave the European Union before 2020, which is early in the projection report. China's long-term economic growth prospect is currently undergoing a transition from an export and investment-driven economy to that one is consumption and service-oriented. China is based on manufacturing, production-rich countries, and also consumption and service-oriented sectors. Nonetheless, the fixed investment remained a key driver for China's economic growth for the moment. In 2015, the fixed investment steadily rose to a new high of 5.7 trillion US dollar, accounting for around 50% of then the total GDP. And it's basically make possible for the government strong push for the infrastructure investment. It's a huge investment as made by the government in the infrastructure sector, which is key food for the economic growth in China particularly. This trend is likely to continue in the coming years as urbanization moves ahead and new government initiatives are rolled out, such as the Belt and Road Initiative that helps international industry capacity cooperation initiatives. The investment is also a powerful tool to help to maintain an average annual GDP growth of around 6.5% in order to achieve the goal of doubling the GDP and GDP per capita by 2020. The key challenges for the investment is twofold: the diminished marginal returns and low level of private investment, which account for the 60% of the total investment. In the first three quarters of 2016, the private investment grew by only 2.5% as compared to 21% for the state sector. Due to the lack of business confidence, the government will need to make sure that future funds will flow into the productive project instead of the zombie enterprises. The service sector has also maintained its strong growth momentum, rising to 53% of GDP in the third quarter of 2016. Then, while the consumption remained those robust and it's contributing 70% of the GDP growth, and which is 13% higher than the year ago. By 2030, the service are expected to rise further to around 70% of GDP, and China's rising middle class that could generate a consumption market of US $6 trillion, the largest in the world. Demographic changes pose several challenges to China's long-term growth. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, China's working age population between the age of 16 and 60 has declined for 3 straight years since 2012, with a 60% of population, over 60 population reaching the 222 million in 2015, accounting for around 16% of the overall population. And this may be the total workforce is predicted to decline about 700 million people by 2050. And with this effect, the two-child policy has adopted too late for the make differences in this trend. But China still has a great potential for the growth. Urbanization process is still at a relatively early stage, but the service sector has a lot of scope to catch up with economies like US in terms of quality, sophistication, and business ranges. The particular as reward producer services such as logistic, information, financing, and commercial services, and reform of the state-owned enterprises properly handled could shatter those monopolies and create a new business opportunities that worth trillions of dollars in future, that driven the China's economic policy and fulfill the dream of superpower in the future. That's all for now. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.